Welcome to Drivetime Exchange. As rubber hits the road, hard talk meets great music. Monday to Thursday, 4 to 6 p.m. on Net Radio, taking you above and beyond.
Why they blaming the doctor so? Tell me, I would like to know why they blaming the doctor so. One class of people fussing, while the other class cussing, running them out like they take pro clocks, and only blaming the doc for the income tax. But I want them all to know we can't get away from the tax. Even if you leave and go, we can't get away from the tax. To New York or Tokyo, you can't get away from the tax. Oh yes, you could jump up high or low, you can't get away from the tax. Even quite in Africa, you can't get away from the tax. You see, doctor and no doctor, you can't get away from the tax.
And with that, we welcome you inside of the Drive Time Exchange right here on the Era TT Radio. And we're so happy to be here with you. Of course, this is where we are joined by none other than journalist extraordinaire, Mr. Tony Fraser. Tony, good day to you.
Good day to you, Sir Charles. How is life?
Oh, it's pretty good, actually. Yeah.
All right. Taking it as it comes.
Definitely.
Right.
And I'm hoping you are doing the same.
You chose a very cogent piece of music there, the Mighty Sparrow, back in the late 50s, early 60s, with the introduction of the income tax by the doctor. Sparrow was very much in league with the governor at that point in time. In fact, he sings another one about his father sharpening the axe to cut off the income tax, and Dr. Williams saying, well, or he's saying that the money is not going in Dr. Williams' pocket, but has to pay for all of the essentials of the society, schooling, education, roads paved, everything, the hospitals, etc., etc. If prior to the independence period, the colony could have depended on Britain to fork out some of the dollars required for the running and the administering of the country, as Dr. Williams related, when the time came for political independence, it meant a little bit more than having a flag and an anthem and so on. It required citizens to fund the operations of the state. And so the Mighty Sparrow got on track with that. In fact, in one of the calypsos, he said his father was sharpening the axe to chop off the income tax. But in the last verse, he inevitably came around and said, well, you put down the axe and you're going to pay the income tax. Of course, over the decades, since then, taxation has become enshrined, and we're talking about Trinidad and Tobago now in the Caribbean, enshrined in the whole organization and administration of the country, and there are all forms of taxes: income tax, corporation tax, VAT, tax for whether you're walking, sleeping, or dying, you have to pay tax. And so that is the discussion we want to engage this afternoon. Listeners would know that one of the elements of the campaign leading up to the election and the government coming in and the party coming into governance and so on, centered around this whole business of the establishment of the Trinidad, the property tax, etc., etc. And one party saying that it would eliminate all of those possibilities if and when it came into office. And the other one saying that those taxes are needed for additional revenue because there are a whole lot of people who are outside there who are not paying up their fair share of the taxes in one form or the other. And therefore, there needed to be some kind of operation that will allow the state to collect the kind of monies that is required to run the country. And we are very fortunate this afternoon to have two persons who have specialized in that kind of taxation matters, not the TTRA business, but in taxation generally. We have Nigel Gittins, who still is an engineer, a civil engineer by profession and all of that, but he has read into and been involved in the research and so on taxation and economic development. He has written two books on the subject on development, and the other one about sustainable development in countries like ours and around the world. Thank you, Nigel, for coming to the program this afternoon. Nigel has a special form of income tax, of taxation, sorry, not income tax, which he will talk about as he introduces it to us. It's not something novel on his part, but something that goes back 100+ years ago by some economists who were writing about it. And indeed, the form of taxation that he's talking about is put into effect in a number of countries around the world. And so, Nigel, thanks for coming. The second guest is Dr. Derek Browne, who is an economist and who worked with the World Bank for several years, worked in different parts of the world or on the accounts of different parts of the world. The World Bank, of course, being the twin institution of the International Monetary Fund, which we in this part of the world know a little bit more of because of the pressures that we have had to undergo when we engage in borrowing from the IMF. Of course, no institution lends you money. If you go to the commercial banks, you have to set up your life and your everything with them before they could hand you a penny. And ditto for those international institutions. Derek, welcome to the program and thanks for agreeing to be part of it. Derek and myself, a few decades ago, were covering political meetings of parties and so on. So we have a long association going. All right, so let me give the floor first to Nigel Gittins to give our listeners an appreciation of the form of tax that you're talking about, its uses and its ability to cover the costs of administering the nation. Your microphone.
Yeah, are you hearing me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I really appreciate the invitation to discuss this very important subject, which is really not seen in Trinidad as important, but that's another story. I'm glad that you started with a historical, in a historical context. As a matter of fact, Eric Williams was very frustrated by the tax receipts that he was receiving over his tenure as a prime minister. And in the 70s, he commissioned a report by John Copes, and I believe it was a British person, who he knew about side value taxation. So he commissioned a person, a sort of expert in that area. And he did the report, John Copes, submitted it. But unfortunately, Eric Williams couldn't implement it. It was towards the end of the 70s, and it was just shelved. He couldn't implement it. He died and all that. And George Chambers, who came in after him as prime minister, towards the end of his tenure, he began to look at the report too, the John Copes report. I have a copy of it. I could send it to you. But again, that opportunity was missed, so that we had two instances where side value taxation, which is the taxation that I sort of prescribed for the nation, was contemplated and may have solved all of our problems. You would know that we have all kinds of taxes in Trinidad, all in an effort to capture enough revenue so that we could meet our expenses. All of this, all of these efforts were not very successful over the years. Even the last regime was always falling short with their revenue budget, and they failed to recoup enough revenue to meet their expenses. They had so many deficit budgets because of the fact that we couldn't recoup the taxes which were out there. It is well believed that it is out there to be captured, but again, we haven't found a mechanism to recoup these taxes. One such mechanism that was prescribed, as you said, many years ago, almost 2 centuries ago, first up by Adam Smith, and then David Ricardo in the 18th century. And then, well, you know about the Wealth of Nations, that famous book that Adam Smith wrote. It's a very tedious book to read, but it does talk about site value taxation. And then we had David Ricardo, who wrote his books towards the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. That again was a very popular publication, but ignored by society. And then in the 19th century, we had Henry George, who wrote the very famous book, Progress and Poverty, which you may or may not know about, but that was an international blockbuster at the time. It really caught the minds of many people. But again, it never seemed to be taken up by the various powers that be all around the world. And then in the 20th century, we had people like Fred Harrison, Leon McLaren, and others who kept this, idea alive, this ideology alive, this tax ideology alive. So that if you know anything about site value taxation, there's really the taxation of the value of sites, land value taxation or site value taxation. So all through the economy, there are sites that are of variant values. Every community has a certain market value, and the idea is to capture this market value, because there's the communities that really create these values, not necessarily any individual person. So the idea is site value taxation is to capture this value, which we feel, well, it has a lot of other side benefits to it, which we could go into as the interview goes forward. But the idea is to capture the true tax revenue, the true tax possibility by use of site value taxation. Site value taxation is just the market value of the site. It's very simple, which I could explain further.
So the occupants of a piece of a site, a land,
yeah,
they will pay taxes based on the operations of the land and the value that comes from it. Yes?
It's based on the value of the site.
Okay.
All right. We recently introduced a property tax, which is quite different from a site value tax. The site value is really the value of the bare land itself, the value that community places on this bare land. And these are easily determined by real estate agents, valuation people, they could tell you what the site value is or the market value of the site.
All right.
That's a common thing. Yeah.
Well, we're going to go into that in a moment, but forgive me, I failed to introduce you two gentlemen to each other, knowing that you didn't know each other before. Derek Browne and Nigel Gittins meet each other. As we indicated, Dr. Derek Browne has been working with the international agency, the World Bank, for a number of years, and he did all kinds of projects with it. Well, first of all, give me your response to what Nigel Gittins has put on the table, and we take the discussion from there.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thanks for inviting me onto this program this afternoon. And it's a pleasure to see you. I think the last time we worked together was about 30 years ago in the 1995 general elections, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
So that was quite a
And we got called out by Ralph Maraj,
yes.
who was on the platform.
So look, this issue of taxation is a very important one, I think, because I think the country finds itself at the moment in a bit of a crisis when it comes to fiscal revenue. And I think Nigel alluded to the fact that we've had deficit budgets now for, I think, the better part of 15 years. So we've been living beyond our means, essentially, for approximately 15 years now. I think there was 1 year, perhaps just after COVID, when revenues went up because of increases in the oil prices.
Yeah.
Nothing of our making, nothing of our particular doing. We're merely price takers in the market. So I think this discussion is very timely on the issue of fiscal revenues or taxation. Before I comment specifically on the issue of the land taxes that Nigel was speaking about, which is an interesting approach to it, I would say that there's a whole lot of discussion in Trinidad and Tobago as well as elsewhere about taxation. One of the things that I found somewhat disturbing, perhaps, is that in the last election campaign, while there were promises being made on both sides, and some people were saying, well, how are you going to pay for these things? It was striking that there was really no discussion on the political platforms about taxation. Neither of the two main parties said anything specifically about the issue of tax reform, for example. And one of the things that I think that we really need to look at seriously in Trinidad and Tobago is a comprehensive review of the tax system and a strategy for tax reform that brings us into line with best practice elsewhere in the world. Now, on the specific issue that Nigel referred to about the land tax, I'm not quite sure how this would work in the context of a country where many people don't actually own the properties they live in. So I'm not sure how you deal with renters, for example. And then there's quite a lot of land that is actually state land. So I'm not sure how you raise revenue out of that. In fact, the state tries to raise revenue by leasing state land. And then when we look at other lands, both agricultural and industrial, as well as residential properties, typically in residential and industrial properties, there are buildings on these properties that constitute assets that increase the value of the land. So having a valuation that is based purely on the price of the land without considering the value of the assets that have been installed on that land seems to me to be a bit of a stretch. So taken together, when we're talking about land tax that is just based on the valuation of the land and no consideration being given to the added value that comes from buildings and so on, as well as the fact that you have a large portion of the population that is not actually land owning, they're renting. It seems to be a very complex way of trying to raise revenue. I thought the effort at raising property taxes was a very worthwhile effort. We used to have land and building taxes, as you know, that was suspended some time ago, and the property taxes were intended to replace those. And I think that it's quite short-sighted even though I don't agree with the way in which the property taxes were introduced in the first place, and we can discuss that later on. I think that it's quite short-sighted to have abandoned the idea of property tax because there are a lot of people in the society whose incomes are not subject to tax for whatever reason, but who invest in property. And so the real worth of of many citizens is actually in the real estate holdings that they have. And it seems to me passing strange that the government would want to abandon property tax. By the way, property tax right now, according to this current year's estimates, revenue estimates, would only have accounted for a very minuscule portion of overall fiscal revenue. So it's not as if property tax was going to be a huge addition to the total tax take of the government. So I'll stop there. I'd be interested to hear Nigel's response to, how he envisages this land tax working. And then I'd like to, have some further discussion about the range of taxes that the government does levy and what sorts of things we might want to consider in terms of the way forward.
Nigel, your turn to respond.
Right. It's a land value tax. That's the first thing. And it applies to the owners of the land in the first instance. And if there are no specific owners that you could identify, the occupiers of the land would fall to the occupiers of the land. Now, what this would do, it would open up the economy. You see, economists and finance people, the Minister of Finance is interested in balancing the budget. But what we have to do is seek to balance the economy. The economy is comprised of three main factors: land, labor, and capital. And because of the difference in values between these three, for instance, land values are much higher than labor values and much higher than capital values. There's an imbalance between these three factors, so that the laborer cannot attain, he cannot own land, he cannot access capital because of his low value system. What site value taxation will do is that it will rush these three factors, bring all of these three factors onto the lands, onto the site. And if it would create the balance so that wealth could be created on the site. So this would cause an opening up of the economy. If you go around any neighborhood now, you see a lot of sites that are just derelict, unoccupied, underdeveloped, But the secret in changing the economic prospects of the country lies in bringing the sites up, bringing them into production. And the best way to do it is to tax the site value. That would bring the labor and the capital onto the site in a way, and you're not taxing individuals, you're taxing the site. The site could have as many individuals as you want. You're not interested really in taxing individuals, because there's an argument against that in many quarters. You're not taxing capital, because there's an argument against that in many quarters. But the site value, the taxation of the site value, is the least of the onerous taxes. It would force the other factors onto the site.
Yeah. Well, Nigel, let me ask you this. You're saying that if there are, lots of unoccupied land, as there are in the present situation, imposing a tax on it will encourage people to the land. That seems a little bit far-fetched to me. Explain.
Well, the owners would have, if there are no owners, the government will have to come into the picture and auction these lands off. With in the agreement of paying the land value tax, you will have access to the site. The owners who are in some cases dead, who are speculating with the land, with the cost of the price of the land value, would be forced to bring the land into use to pay this land value tax, or sell it to somebody else who is willing to occupy the land and develop the land, and that would create businesses, would create employment, it would increase the diversification that we're looking for, it will increase competition, it would raise wages, because more sites are producing, and the value of wages would come up, because there'll be more need for labor on these.
So you are saying. So you're saying, Nigel, it will not be in the interest of owners of property to leave that property unused, underutilized.
Absolutely.
They will still have to pay some form of taxes if they do not bring it into
Absolutely.
production.
Absolutely. And this land value tax applies to all the sites, not only the vacant sites or the underutilized. Everybody has to pay this tax. And it has many implications, you know. This thing,
Right.
Our lack of data in the country about who owns what or who has what, or you know, our paucity of data. This could create a revolution in so many ways.
Right. Dr. Browne raised the issue of government property. And it's well known that, I don't know what the percentage is, but government owns the large share, the lion's share, as it were, of property all around the country. How will that go? Will the government have to pay taxes on unused property?
No, the government is the arbiter. They are the persons who they will dictate which sites are to be brought onto the marketplace. So they will have to determine what are the needs for sites in the economy.
Dr. Browne.
They will release sites for auction. Once you can meet the site value tax, you have access to it. But they are planning and developing the country, so they will know how to release. The very same planning and development ministry will have a big role to play. You see, you're developing the whole economy, and that's the way to do it, to develop the sites.
Okay. Derek Browne, responding.
I'm still not clear. I mean, there are a number of assertions there in terms of, taxing sites resulting in opening of the economy, creation of employment, and so on and so forth, and even diversification. I don't know how this works. I don't know how by taxing land sites. And let's take for instance, let's say a government constructed NHA, or what is it called now, HDC, apartment building in, let's say, East Port of Spain, or somewhere along the East-West corridor, or anywhere else for that matter.
Yeah.
That contains, I don't know, 200 apartments that are rented to tenants, who, by the way, are not paying the rents. It's state property. Technically, it belongs to the state. It is tenanted. Who pays the tax?
Well, are the owners or the occupiers?
Okay, but the tenants are supposed to be paying rents at the moment.
The owners or the occupiers have the obligation to pay the tax.
Okay, so the owner is the state, the HDC. The occupiers are 200 individual families, 200 families or individual households. Well, who pays the tax?
The occupiers. If the owners have to pass this on to the occupiers, they will.
Okay, but the owner is the state, and you already said the state is the arbiter. They're not the ones who are paying.
Well, they will
tax.
pass it on to
collecting.
They will pass it on to the occupiers,
which they already do in the form of a rent.
Yes. That rent goes into government coffers.
Yeah, yes. Just to get inside there for a moment, the owners, the occupiers are paying the rent. It is well known that across the country, all of the housing developments that have been built by the state, there are serious problems collecting the rent. Far more to add a tax onto it.
As I said, this system will allow greater prospects for employment, which I feel is the real reason why.
But could you explain how?
How what?
How would it facilitate greater employment?
If you bring more sites onto the marketplace, the sites have to have labor and capital to produce wealth. Land, labor, capital produces wealth. If you apply the site value tax, the creation of wealth would produce. Well, you have to employ people to create the wealth.
Okay, so the wealth is being created either by through agricultural production
Yes, and all types
development
of
into
economic
residential
activity.
communities or industrial development.
All sites have to pay the tax.
But isn't that what the property tax is now?
No, the property tax is a disincentive. You see, people have paid the taxes on the property already. The what do you call it? The when you are taking out a mortgage. What do you call that tax? There's a
Stamp
tax
duty.
Stamp duty. The objection is that this stamp duty is paid up already. Right?
Very good point. So this is one of the things, one of the objections to the property tax that I've heard quite a lot about. That at the time when you purchase the house, this is why I said earlier that I think we need to have a very comprehensive review.
And then you are paying taxes on labor and material that you use to build the house,
on which you've already paid VAT and so on and so forth. Yeah. So this is one argument that I've heard quite a lot, that you've paid stamp duty, you've paid VAT on the inputs into the development of the, let's say, the home, if it's a home.
Yes.
And then now you're being asked to pay a recurrent tax, an annual tax on the value of the property.
What the economic icons have said is that if you occupy a site of value, that is a privilege that the community has given to you, right? So you have to now give back to the community that value that other participants in the community doesn't have. You have this special privilege of occupying this site, so that you have to compensate the society for allowing you that privilege, right? So that all persons who occupy sites of value will have to give to the state.
So what you're describing sounds very much like feudalism.
Feudalism?
Yes.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Except that
once you pay this tax, you are free to produce. You are free to make.
But not everybody can produce in that sense. So, for example, you might have land, what you're describing as a site, okay, that is, let's say, prime agricultural land. Now, to make it productive, what you mean by produce is to turn it into agricultural, to turn it to agricultural use, to produce crops. Okay.
Right. So you can't have an agricultural site in a commercial center.
Right. So you have
residential
agricultural
site
land. Right.
So you have to. That will force people to go to a site that they could manage the payment on.
I see. So in other words, people would have to move depending on what they can afford. So some people who can afford to construct, let's say, homes, will move to one place where the land is meant for homes. And people who can't afford that, What do they do?
Well, I would just say the economic icons have said that you apply a tax that is based on taxable capacity for the activity of that thing.
And given the kind of numbers,
but notwithstanding that, people have to move out of commercial areas that are better suited if they're living in a commercial area, in order to allow more commercial activity, more wealth to be produced. If they are stopping that happening, then it would be better for them to move out.
But that's already happened. I mean, there used to be residential areas all along the streets of Port of Spain. I mean, I had a great aunt who lived on Henry Street. I used to go there to look at Mass from her balcony.
Yeah,
but nobody lives on Henry Street.
And the site I used to live in is a commercial site now.
Yeah, nobody lives on Henry Street. Yes, Woodbrook is being converted into a commercial district.
It's a natural occurrence, but you see the site value tax will quicken up the thing.
Yeah, I'm not sold on this whole idea of a land value tax.
I will send a copy of my book to you. I mean,
I'd be grateful. I looked on Amazon. I saw it there. It's expensive. Yeah. I hope you're making a lot of royalties.
No, man, it's not expensive. If you give me your email address, I could send you a digital copy. That's not a problem.
No, but Tony, I want to make a point. I want to make a point.
Sorry, Derek, before you move off of that, just let me inform our listeners, because they're hearing voices, they're joining and coming back and so on, and they may not know who is speaking at this point in time. So we have two persons with us this afternoon. Nigel Gittins, the man who has picked up a 200-year-old notion. And Nigel, I'm surprised that you have not told us that it's operational in certain countries around the world. But you're going to get to that in a moment.
Right.
So Nigel Gittins is talking about this
Right.
site tax, this land site tax, and
Mm-hmm.
commercial or residential activity on it. And we have Dr. Derek Browne, who, as we introduced at the start, is an economist who has not only worked with the World Bank, but worked within the Caribbean Development Bank, setting the CARICOM Development Finance Agency, I think the name was it, or something like this. And they're talking about taxation. And Derek, your turn to move into whatever areas that you want to move into.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. I was just going to say that right now, if we look at a breakdown of fiscal revenue, of the government's fiscal revenue, what we see is that taxes on income and profits, that is to say, income taxes and corporate taxes, account for by far the largest share of revenue, something like about 66%. I'm using the last government published estimates of revenue for the fiscal year 2025. So we see that taxes on income and profits account for about 66.4%. Taxes on goods and services, so typically we're talking about VAT, account for another 25.2%. Taxes on trade, that is customs revenue, import tariffs, this thing that Trump is talking about, that's another 7% or so. Now, interestingly, in many countries in the Caribbean, not necessarily in Trinidad and Tobago, where it's relatively small, 7%, but in most Caribbean countries, customs revenues account for the largest share of taxation or tax revenue. Why? Because frankly, we import everything, and everything that is imported is taxable. Motor vehicles, refrigerators, you name it, we import it, it's taxable. So there are import duties paid on goods when they come into the country. There's VAT sold on these, taxed on these goods, associated with these goods once they're sold. So you're paying VAT on things that for which your import tariffs have been paid, and of course the consumer is paying, despite whatever the U.S. president might argue, it's the consumer who ultimately pays the import tariff and so on. I'm just curious to know, how would this land site tax, what kind of revenue yield would be expected, and whether it could make up for all of these things combined, plus the shortfall, because our revenue is about, if I'm not mistaken, $12 or $15 billion below expenditure estimates. Okay. So we're spending $12 to $15 billion more than we're able to collect.
Sorry, I have a phone call here that sorry so about that, gentlemen.
Yeah, that deficit has to be made up somehow, and if it's not through some form of tax revenue, it has to be done by borrowing, which is what we've resorted.
Okay. Are you through with your? I don't want to cut you across. But
yes, sure. Please go ahead.
All right. Site value taxation is really a subtle way of changing the dynamics in an economy. We have an unemployment problem. Unemployment situation could change dramatically. Employment to full employment or more, dramatically by use of site value taxation. Government workers, we have in my staff, we overstaffed in the government sector. We don't have need for all these people working. Site value taxation could allow the government over time to dispense with half of the workers off the bat. Because of the sites producing, and employment opportunities are there, and businesses are set up, business formation is increasing. The need for government to employ people, the need for social services would decrease.
Sorry, why would the need for social services decrease?
Because people working, more people will be working, and the need to rely on the state for for assistance would decrease substantially.
Yeah. But Nigel, what happens to those persons who you've cast aside? Persons who don't have jobs, persons who are not as productive. It rings a little bell like Trump and Musk, you let people go because you want to bring down the government payroll and all of that. What happens to them?
Well, they will have opportunities for work on sites that are beginning to that are having businesses set up. More businesses are being created, That's so that you don't have need for the government doesn't have the obligation to find work for all these people. The state, the private sectors would increase substantially. More businesses would be set up because the sites are developing.
So, Nigel, I have a question. I mean, in fact, a couple. I think what you're arguing is based on you've made a number of assertions,
right?
That I'm trying to understand, what lies beneath them. So, you've repeated several times that if we introduce a land value tax, right, that this is somehow going to result in increased economic activity, increased employment
over time,
increased employment, and now you've added to that a reduction in government expenditure on staffing, on wages and salaries.
Right, because
so there are a number of assertions
because of technology. You don't need all these workers.
So there are a number of assertions you've made. One is that somehow if you have a site value or a land value tax, it's going to result in an expansion in business and creation of more employment. And how exactly that works, I don't get it.
We have a lot of capital parked up in the banks. A lot of people park the capital up in the banks. We have need for capital when these sites are beginning to form, business formation, etc. We will need the capitals. The banks would then be in a position because of the buoyancy of the economy to, lend capital. In some instances, the government will provide capital. They will literally print money because goods and services are being produced.
But produced where? You mentioned the buoyancy in the economy, but where is this buoyancy to come from?
From the sites. The sites will be producing tradable goods and services.
No, but this is a circular argument because you're saying that if we have a land value or a site value tax, it will result in the unleashing of economic activity. Businesses will be created, but it's the very banks that you're talking about that have to do the intermediation that will mobilize resources to invest in these businesses. Yes. So
the sites would need capital for wealth wealth production, for producing goods and services. The banks would be more confident in lending money out
because it's collateralized.
Right. Government will also assist in providing, increasing the money supply. Because you see, money is only backed by goods and services. That's how the money is legitimized. If you know what I mean, you need capital to form, together with land and labor, to form the wealth. So these sites are free, and they are being allowed to form businesses of a diversified nature, because everybody competing, everybody is competing, everybody is producing, so that their goods and services could be tradable.
I'm sorry. I mean,
how does a business form? Not by not by
entrepreneurs, which by the way you haven't mentioned, but
right.
Entrepreneurs mobilize resources.
That isn't the labor aspect of it.
No, that's not labor. Entrepreneurs are not labor.
That is labor. That is skilled and professional labor. That is labor.
You mentioned
human beings.
You mentioned earlier the factors of production, land, labor, capital. Right. But there's also entrepreneurship. Having land, labor, and capital without entrepreneurship.
Henry George and David Ricardo said that the labor have different categories.
So the entrepreneurs you categorize
Entrepreneurs
as labor.
is also labor.
Okay.
But of a special nature.
Okay. And
right.
and your view is that if we had a site value tax, we would somehow produce more entrepreneurs? Because one of the weaknesses we have now as a society is that there is a dearth of entrepreneurial spirit and activity.
Well, it will change that. Site value tax will change that.
But you keep making these assertions without explaining to me how.
Well, you will train more. You will train more entrepreneurs. You will train more skilled people. A lot of them can't find work now. You will increase the supply of all the various categories of labor.
Nigel, let me ask you a question of dealing with a specific group of people, a specific geographic place. Let's take John. Let's take someplace in central Trinidad, outside of the thriving economic belt that is, going in parts of central Trinidad. How do these people are able to pay the land tax, given that there is little or no economic activity in those areas,
well,
which you can base the tax?
Right. When you introduce this tax, you are in fact changing the whole behavioral psyche of the nation. There'll be eventually more jobs will be available, even for these downtrodden souls that you're talking about. When they are able to get work, they will be able to pay the tax. The taxes wouldn't be demanded right away.
Where are they going to get the jobs from?
From the sites that are opening up. The very sites that are held out of production, the valuable sites, will need labor. If you go along any street in Port of Spain, any street in Port of Spain, you'll see at least 2 or 3 sites that are just not producing.
Yeah, well, we're talking about the sites in places like John, and in central Trinidad, up in the back of there's a village.
Houses that to be built.
But houses have already been built on those areas. People are living in those areas. In fact, there is little space in a place like John for anything else to be constructed there.
These special development areas, I call them, well, the economic icons call them that. You will have to not apply the site value tax in those areas in the first instance. Only when the society begins to become buoyant, people begin to have jobs and all that. You may even have to decant some of these areas and then rebuild. Areas like John and Laventil and Laventil Road and these areas that may need rebuilding. Those are special projects. You wouldn't apply a site value tax to those areas. But certainly the people who are living there will have opportunities for employment at better wages in the economy that is beginning to pick up, beginning to increase in economic activity because of the site value tax.
Wow. Yeah. Rick, you want to come in here?
Well, I mean, you mentioned, Tony, that you mentioned that Nigel, in his book, had cited some countries where this has been implemented. And if you could give us some examples, I'd be interested to hear.
Australia has 6 states, if I remember. 6 states. Right, 6. 3 of those states have site value tax as part of their regime, and three of
they have it as part of
the other 3.
I think he said tax regime.
Sorry,
you said that
tax
they have
regime.
site value
3
taxes.
of those states have, part of it, and the 3 others don't have. You know which street sites are the richer sites?
The ones that have it. I think he's frozen.
He's frozen a little bit there. All right, so we wait. Yes, you're back on?
I'm back on. I think I'm back on.
Okay.
Right. The 3 sites that have employed it said my internet connection is unstable. But the three sites that employ it have tended to be more prosperous areas. They have more people living there, more production of wealth, etc. And they track that back to the fact that they have site value tax. A study was done. I have a copy of the study. And the three sites that are sort of poorer sites have not employed that. That's one area. I think certain parts of America have it, but it's not clear whether that it works there.
I don't know.
China wants to implement it. There are many other sites all over the world many other states all over the world that have it, but no studies. No studies to show, But certainly Australia, you could look it up.
Yeah. I mean, look.
And New Zealand to some extent.
I was struck by the fact that you mentioned that this site value tax in those three Australian states are part of their fiscal regime. In other words, that is not the totality of it. So it's not like they're entirely dependent on that.
And I didn't mention that this is not, you will not disband corporate capital and labor taxes. You're not going to do that. It's a sort of it's a kind of raising up and a lowering up. In fact, we need to lower our taxes.
Yeah. I was
right.
I mean.
So we using the site value tax as an incentive to produce more wealth, and we also reducing taxes on labor and capital as an incentive. Right.
So
let me
just
reorganize the labor. In certain areas, labor in the government, public sector could come down and go into the private sector. As a matter of fact, the only reason why you have a government state sector is to assist the private sector to produce wealth. Yeah. People don't understand that.
Okay, Derek wants to say something. Go ahead, Derek.
Sure. I was going to say that we have a problem in Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, there are two things. There are two aspects to taxation. One is tax policy, and one is tax administration. Okay, I think we need to review our tax policy and the mix of taxes that we use to collect revenue, and then we also need to take a careful look at our tax administration. Now, the Revenue Authority was an attempt to address the tax administration aspect of it.
Well, you will need a revenue authority to do that.
Yeah, the Revenue Authority was...
The taxes that are in this current form,
But what we have in Trinidad and Tobago is a problem of a low tax to GDP level, okay?
Right.
As in most countries, the tax to GDP level in the average is about 34%. In other words, that is your taxation, your revenue as a percentage of your GDP. It's roughly about 34%.
So, Derek, if you can explain that a little bit more for our listeners who may not be up on the language that you're using.
Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that the tax revenue that the government collects is approximately 34% of the GDP of the country. Okay, the value of the GDP of the country, and that's the sort of global average. When we look at our situation in Trinidad and Tobago, we're at about 16.5%. So we're well below,
no doubt,
the global average. Well below the global average. So there's a lot of room there for increased tax collection.
Yeah.
So I think
just to say one thing: site value tax cannot be hidden. It lies it's out of doors. It's in the open. You can't hide it. You can't evade the tax.
Yeah. All right. Compared with, let's say, Jamaica, where the tax to GDP ratio is about 25%, or even our neighbor in Barbados, where it's about 24%, we're at 16%. So we're pretty low. Yeah. Okay.
Tax evasion,
tax avoidance.
Rampant in this country.
The people who pay income taxes are largely employees, the people who are employed.
Yes.
Mainly public servants.
Yeah.
Because their taxes are deducted at source, PAYE, as we call it, pay as you earn. So your taxes are deducted at source and remitted to the Board of Inland Revenue. Of course, I mentioned VAT. Now, I want to make a point about VAT. The original purpose of the VAT, when it was introduced in the 80s by the NAR government, was to deal with people who were not paying income taxes. Because if you couldn't tax people's income, because you didn't know what the income was, you would tax their consumption. everybody buys goods and services. So you're taxing on that side. The problem that has arisen is that the tax refunds have been withheld by the Ministry of Finance. Now that's a serious issue.
Well, it's more than that. They're not collecting it.
No, they're collecting the VAT. The problem is that the Ministry of Finance, they're not, perhaps there's some avoidance on the VAT as well. But what I'm saying is that the Ministry of Finance is collecting VAT and not reimbursing or refunding businesses the VAT, the refunds that they're entitled to.
They probably can't. They probably can't. They don't have. They need the money.
This is a problem. This is a major problem insofar as the cash flow of businesses are concerned, especially smaller businesses.
I think the VAT should be disbanded.
And so I was coming to this point, so that in my view, as a consequence of what we have seen over the last, not just 10 years, I would say more than 10 years, because this started under the last People's Partnership Administration. As a consequence of this withholding of VAT refunds, I am of the view that we need to disband the VAT, the value-added tax, and move to a flat consumption tax, a sales tax, whatever you want to call it. We have a flat tax that we apply to the sale of to goods and services. You can call it as a consumption tax, as it's called in some countries, GCT. You can call it a general consumption tax. You can call it a general sales tax. You can call it a goods and services tax, whatever you want to call it, doesn't matter. But I'm in favor of getting away from that and moving away from a system that involves refunds, because what this has done, the impact that this has had, is that it has eroded trust in government. It has eroded trust in the Ministry of Finance in particular. And it has served as it has proven to be a disincentive for people to pay taxes overall, not just VAT, but taxes overall. So there's the VAT. There's the income tax, where I think our income tax rate is, I think, somewhere in the order of 25%.
25% over $80,000. Yeah.
So from what I can tell, 25% over chargeable income up to $1 million.
That's the businesses, on the business side.
No, okay. Any income? No. This is the taxes. 25% on chargeable income up to $1 million. Okay. This is according to the overview produced by PricewaterhouseCoopers, dated January 31st.
So a person has to make $1 million and then be taxed beyond that?
25% tax on chargeable income up to $1 million. Over $1 million is 30%.
Oh, but so I'm talking about the lower level where I'm not taxed at all, is $80,000.
Oh, you're talking about the lower level where there's the tax exempt. Okay, okay.
Right.
So, I was saying that you pay 25 on the chargeable income up to $1 million, over $1 million, 30%. Okay.
Right.
In Barbados, they're paying 28.5% income tax. In Jamaica, they're paying 30%.
Right.
So here again, we have, we're not collecting. And as I said, the majority of taxpayers in that bracket are actually the people who are employees, the labor you were talking about.
Right.
We're talking about mainly public servants. I want to come back to a point you made about public servants a little earlier. And then there's the...
Sorry, Derek, before you go on, I have a question on, if you like, the psychology of the VAT. We have grown accustomed to going to the supermarket or wherever, and an item is $10, and you almost do not, you're not aware that there is a VAT attached to it of $1, whatever the figure is. And therefore, you pay the $11 without feeling pressured. If you're going to move from that to another form of tax where you have to deliberately pay it, wouldn't that be a kind of disincentive?
No, on the contrary, what I'm talking about is a flat sales tax that is actually much less than the rate at which we charge VAT now. So our VAT is 12.5%. Yeah. Again, I like to compare.
Well, the very few items are vatable now,
Well, that's also part of it.
The thing is dying a slow death.
Well, and the new government has come in that has argued that they're going to remove
everything.
A vast number of goods. So I don't know what is the point of it anymore. But I think it's a good thing because it removes this opportunity for the Ministry of Finance to withhold refunds, right? But we have a relatively low rate of VAT. And one of the things that always intrigues me, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but across the Caribbean, is that we zero rate, for VAT purposes, we zero rate a basket of goods, which are almost inherently those things that will cause an increase in the rate of diabetes in the country and hypertension. So we
Right.
encourage people to buy things that are not good for them to eat.
Right.
And then we spend a lot of money on healthcare. You see? Whereas the things that are considered luxury items, but the more healthy things to eat, you know, we don't zero rate those things.
Well, in my book, I mentioned the fact that the reason why there's so much health issues in the country that we are not educating our young people in the high schools.
That's partially true. That's partially true, yes. I think you're right.
So that
Gentlemen, I want to introduce something else in all of the projections, both in terms of the land site value taxation and other forms of taxation. I think Derek was going to talk about what he's advocating as an alternative or an addition to the various taxes, which I'll give him a moment to do so. What of the equity in the various forms of taxation?
Exactly.
What is called progressive and what is called regressive, meaning is that the regressive, that the people at the lower end of the economic ladder are paying perhaps not more, but in terms of percentage to what people on top are earning. What of the regressive nature of that form of taxation that you're talking about, Nigel?
Well, Adam Smith has his 4 canons of good taxation. I don't know if you're aware of that. One of which is tax equity. What the businessmen have done, although they have the taxes are applied to them in whatever way, customs or whatever, these taxes are passed on to the consumer, and the consumer in most instances are poorer people who, you know. So the tax equity is not so in the community. It's more weighted against the poorer classes. Right? Now, site value tax deals with all of that. Site value tax is, you know, applies to lands that are outside that cannot be, you can't hide it, you can't evade it. It applies across the community. My prescription in my book is to reduce the taxes on labor and capital slowly. In other words, you don't go beyond 15% in either case, and increase site value taxes. Start with about 70% of the market value of the site, and you're paying this over the year. You're not asking for that in one shot. You're giving people a chance to, you know, and it applies to the site. So if 10 people live on a site, it don't apply to any one person. It applies to the site. They will figure out how they're paying the tax. While you're reducing taxes on labor and capital, I would prescribe not more than 15% taxation, even for big businesses, and that would have a tremendous effect in producing economic activity all through the community.
Okay.
There's too much taxes, and then the whole question of
I agree with his last point that a reduction in the rate of corporate income tax on profits would be
and you replace it with side value tax.
That part I'm not sold on, but the idea of reducing the taxes on corporate profits is really a way of incentivizing the private sector to invest, to expand, to grow, and to create more employment. I also agree with your point about
pay the tax.
I also agree with your point about
paying the tax.
I also agree with your point about the tax system having to be equitable. I mean, the three hallmarks I would say would be efficiency, transparency,
that's right,
and equity or fairness. And in this regard, I want to say, you know, you talk about the land value or site value tax, but the property tax is actually one of the most equitable taxation measures that we could have.
No.
Because once you have a valuation on the property, obviously people who have multiple properties and more expensive properties will pay more taxes. And those
So
who have...
why do you want to tax a person with the property of a person? Why do you want to tax that?
Now, your objection to the taxation...
That's taxing the
Okay,
labor.
Nigel, allow him to answer. Ask a
sorry.
question.
Let me just give an example. And this is where I said earlier that I had a difficulty with the way in which the whole property tax thing was sold to us in the first place. I live in Maryland in the United States, actually in Montgomery County. Okay? Property taxes here are very high. Property taxes there are property taxes across this country. The property taxes are collected by the county, not by the federal government, by the county. So in the context of Trinidad and Tobago, we're talking about regional corporations. The idea of the property tax was that they would fund the activities of the regional corporations. However,
yes,
that is how it was sold to us. The problem was that not long before the introduction of the legislation on the property tax, there was legislation on regional corporations just prior to the local government elections. Why was the provision for property tax not included in there? That is where it ought to be.
Because the government has need for revenue.
So the government has need for revenue, and so the reluctance to pay the property tax is because people think it's going to disappear into the consolidated fund and the regional corporations will never see it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem. So in my view, what we need is property tax that is actually collected by the regional corporations for use by the regional corporations.
It would never happen.
And the central government only tops up those regional corporations that do not reach, because of course, the country is not all the same. So Toko Manzanilla, for example, the Sangre Grande regional will collect less than Diego Martin. And therefore, you might want to top them up from national government revenue, central government revenue.
But Derek, wasn't that the stated desire and intention?
That was the stated desire and intention. However, the problem was that the legislation for the property tax and the legislation for the regional corporations there's no connection between them. So how do we know that when you collect the property tax, that is where it's going? There's a distrust. I mentioned the trust issue. I mentioned it earlier about the VAT refunds. There's also a problem of trust because we have paid health surcharges and we have not seen tangible improvements in the healthcare system. We have paid road taxes and we don't see tangible improvement in the roads, in the maintenance of the roads. And so people have this lack of enthusiasm about paying taxes because they believe that it disappears into the consolidated fund. And more than anything else, it is being used to pay public servant salaries and wages, transfers and subsidies. Okay, those are the two big expenditure items: public service salaries and wages, transfers and subsidies. And these two things are what we call sticky expenditures. These are not things that are easy to cut because they become what are called entitlements, particularly on the transfers and subsidy side. They become entitlements.
And in instances, they are not very productive.
They're not productive. They're not productive. Yeah.
Non-productive. All right. Let me ask Derek. So we've talked about all of these matters and all of the different options and possibilities for taxation. In the back of our minds, we keep Sparrow. Sparrow said the money going in the doctor pocket, and therefore there is a need for all of these things to be paid for. What would you, given your knowledge of our taxation system now, what are some of your recommendations to ensure that the government gets the kind of revenues that it requires, and also it must be seen to be fair to citizens from the top, in the middle, and the bottom?
So, is that addressed to me?
Yes, well, start with, yeah.
So you again, I make, just to repeat one of the points you've made, there is a reluctance for many people to pay taxes because they don't know what they're getting in return for these taxes. This is a common problem, not just in Trinidad and Tobago, but many countries. So you have, on the income tax side, many people who either shield their incomes or hide their incomes, part of their incomes, people who have a very classical example, medical doctors who might work in the public sector, but who also work in the private sector, but who take payments in cash. Unknown, you don't know how much they're earning.
And they don't give you a receipt.
They don't give you a receipt. They collect all this, they collect their payments in cash. All the vendors who,
Yes.
all over the country that, you see them every time you hear about some robbery of a vendor and so on, you hear about all these hundreds of thousands of dollars that they have at home or where have you. The point is, there are a lot of people in the country that are earning incomes but who are not paying taxes. Taxation is your subscription fee for membership in civil society. So the first thing to do is to make sure that
expand on that, a very important point, Derek.
Oh, I mean, we expect certain things from the state. And so to be a member of civil society, to be entitled to the protection of the state, to be entitled to get a passport, to be entitled to all the things that we expect the state to do, health, education, and so on, it requires revenue. The state doesn't conjure up money out of thin air. The problem we have is that because we've had energy revenues for a long time, we've become accustomed to the state providing all these things for us. Mm-hmm. And so they were not paying too much attention to revenue collection because we had the energy revenues coming in. The problem is now that the revenues have fallen from energy. We have to turn towards domestic revenue mobilization. We have to collect more taxes. So all the untaxed people, I'm very much in favor of the property tax, but I'm also in favor of the property tax being used for the intended purpose. That is to say that the people who live in a certain district that is served by a regional corporation pay the taxes into that regional corporation. They have to learn to manage the money and they must be held accountable. Mm-hmm. The problem, one of the arguments that was made by the central government was that they're weak. They don't have the capacity. Well, then you have to give them the capacity. You have to create that capacity so that they can collect the revenues and manage those resources to look after the districts that they're the regions that they're responsible for.
In addition to those who are collecting the taxes and the capacity issue, you have questions being raised about the people who are employed in these regional corporations and do not have the capacity, same capacity issue, to utilize the funding, the revenue, in a way that it makes sense.
Yes.
And you get value from it.
Yes, and I have to say, the only way to address that problem is to help them to build the capacity, and the citizens who vote them into office have to hold them accountable. In every regional corporation, they're elected. They're not self-appointed. They're elected by the people who live in the areas they serve, and they must be held accountable. If you don't give them the opportunity to build the capacity and to manage the resources, they will never do it. So it's a chicken and egg conundrum that we face here. You don't want to do it because they don't have the capacity, but they will never have the capacity if you don't allow them to do it. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that's my view on the property tax issue. I'm a strong believer in the property tax. I think it's fair, I think it's equitable, and I think it's transparent, but it must be based on proper valuations. We must also address the issue that was raised by Nigel about the stamp duty and so on, because a lot of people believe that if I paid stamp duty when I purchased the property, why do I need to? We have to have a program to educate people. I think the stamp duty is excessive. I think they should. This is why I said we need a whole review of our tax system. The stamp duty is excessive. We need to find a way to reduce the stamp duty, but people must be educated to understand what is the purpose of the property tax in relation to the stamp duty. It's not that. And that the property tax is actually used for its intended purpose. Mm-hmm. Okay, once people actually, one last point I want to make. There's something they call Wagner's Law. It's addressed to what Nigel said earlier about, if more people employed you'll have less demand for social services. Actually, quite the contrary. Quite the contrary. What the evidence points to in many countries around the world is that the more prosperous the country becomes, is the greater the demand for services. People expect more, not less.
You mean homeless? I'm talking about homeless people, and
I'm talking about citizens in countries that have, as prosperity increases, people's expectations increase, not go down. They increase.
But that is not a government. That is not a social service. That is, that's work for the psychiatrist or whoever.
No. When you say social services, it covers a whole plethora of things. Are you only talking about
services in our case in Trinidad?
You're talking about disability grants and so on?
The indigent, the poor, the homeless, the downtrodden. We're not a first world country as yet. So we don't
we're not a first world country, but the point is that we do have middle class aspirations, and people expect more, they expect better. And
but what I'm trying to say,
But what I'm trying to say is that when in most societies, when as people's expectations rise, the state becomes more, the demand for goods and services from the state increases, not goes down. So that contrary to what you were saying, I'm not talking about the grants for the poor and disabled and so on and so forth, unemployment grants and so on. I'm talking about generally the services that the state provides. People expect better services. They expect more services. They expect the state to do more, not less.
Well, they will get that.
They have to pay for it. And they have to pay for it.
We have a work ethic problem in this country. You know, people
absolutely,
don't work.
Absolutely.
And
there's
this
a productivity
site value
issue.
tax will change all that. You have to work.
Again, I don't know how. You keep making these assertions, but I don't understand how.
Because the competition that would come about will force people to work, have to do the work. Yeah, you know.
It sounds to me like
when you read my book, you'll see what you know. When you read my book, you'll see what I'm talking about. But it will change the whole work ethic, change the whole the nature, the culture of the people in Trinidad.
Well, that would be very interesting because I'd be really interested to read your book.
And we have a diversification. That's the only way. See, people feel that government has to do the development, or we have individuals have to develop in order for them.
I agree with that. I agree with that.
For development to take place.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
How are you going to do that?
The point I'm making is that I don't see, you keep making a lot of assertions about the land value or site value tax, about the benefits that will accrue.
Yeah.
But when I ask you, well, how does it work? How do you implement this thing? And what, how will these jobs be created? How will these businesses be created? How will these
maybe Nigel believes in the market forces will drive people to work more industriously, etc., etc.
Absolutely.
If they have to pay a land value tax.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to change our culture.
Agreed.
Agreed. This laid back approach that we have, to think that things will fall from heaven, manna will fall from heaven and things will be okay. That has to change.
I agree with you.
Change.
There's no argument there. There's no argument.
And America has done itself a disservice in giving the Chinese people all their work, and they have laid back now, and now they are changing. They are trying to change back. It's the work ethic. The work ethic in Trinidad has to change.
Yeah. I think there is agreement between both of you on one point, that there needs to be greater sources of tax revenue that can be collected. Perhaps you disagree as to how that is going to happen, what is going to be the incentive, or what's going to be the administrative form to ensure the collection of more taxes. But I think you both agree that there needs to be greater collection of outstanding taxes to the government and to the society. Am I right on that, gentlemen?
That you have to have more accountability. You have very little accountability in this country. We don't know who is doing what, which businesses are, a lot of businesses are doing business and not accounting to the state in terms of paying the taxes. All of that has to change.
Can that happen? The present government came into office and we knew beforehand that it was not going to settle with the tax revenue authority, which was established by the previous government. Can that system, can they get what is required out of the system, the existing system, before the tax revenue authority came into existence?
Absolutely not. I don't know how they're going to do it. As a matter of fact, it will be a very interesting 5 years. They may come to the senses and not disband the revenue authority. In fact, I don't think they will do it.
Political back is a difficult exercise to engage in,
When they can't pay the staff, when they can't pay people, that will show them, that they have to. In any event, even if they have the revenue authority in place, it still doesn't solve the problem of creating more revenue. Still doesn't solve the problem.
Derek?
Well, I mean, again, I think that the creation of a revenue authority is something that has been urged upon us now for 30
Studies have been done on that. World Bank and
more than
IMF.
30 years.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I have worked with revenue authorities in other jurisdictions. And I give one example that I always feel, is a very interesting example of Ghana. Ghana has a revenue authority, the GRA, Ghana Revenue Authority, that has developed a capacity to cross-tabulate people's various databases that the government holds. So, for example, of course, as the revenue authority, they're collecting income tax, they're collecting VAT, they're collecting corporate income taxes. Okay, there's also they introduce land taxes or property taxes in Ghana. So they control a database in which all of these things can be monitored, but they also link it into a database in the vehicle registry, so they know what cars you own. They link it into a database in the property registry, so they know what properties you own. They link it into your bank accounts. Okay, so that
including foreign bank accounts.
Well, no, not for. Well, under the FACTA and the one that the EU have, there is mutual reporting. So if I have a bank account in the United States and I live in Trinidad and Tobago, I have to file a thing showing the source of my income for that bank account, and vice versa. So there's mutual reporting now. My point is simply that the Ghana Revenue Authority is able to look at the individual taxpayer from a number of perspectives. It's not just from the perspective of the taxes, but you tell me you don't have enough income to pay these taxes, but I notice you own 2 BMWs and a Mercedes-Benz. You tell me you don't have the income to pay these taxes, but I notice you have 2 properties in a very expensive residential area. In other words, the tax authority has a handle on the individual and is doing a lot more tax audits, because when these things are triggered, they say, no, hold on, we have to check this guy out. Why is Tony Fraser telling me that he can't pay these taxes, but he's driving around in all these motor vehicles? Right? So many vehicles registered in his name. One belonged to the daughter driving it, one the wife driving it, one he's driving it. Okay? So you can do that in a revenue authority. A revenue authority also hires a completely different caliber of staff. It's outside of the civil service, really, and it operates in a very and in a very technological environment, by the way, because a lot of this is technology driven. Look, in some countries they've even started using AI to track taxpayers and so on.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that can be done in a revenue authority that I suspect will never be done in the Board of Inland Revenue.
So notwithstanding all of that,
Derek, sorry, before you go in, Nigel, I am tempted to conclude from what you've just said, Derek, that there may be forces, and I'm using a kind of neutral word, in this country, which may be afraid of that kind of scrutiny that comes into existence with the revenue authority.
I suspect that too.
I strongly believe that there are indeed forces, to use your term, there are interests in the society that are not in favor of strengthening the tax collection. Whether it is property tax, whether it is income tax, there are certainly interest groups in the society who have absolutely no interest. It's like the Republicans in the United States. They do everything possible to cripple the IRS. The Democrats want to put more staff, they want to put more equipment, they want to invest in modernizing the IRS. And the Republicans come in, the first thing they do is they cut it. Cut out the staff, cut out, because they want to hobble the IRS so that it cannot collect the taxes. You see? So the people who are avoiding taxes can escape.
And they bring a man with a power sword to cut off all of those possibilities.
An Argentine power sword, no less.
Nigel, you wanted to
Derek,
say something?
you were talking about Ghana, but notwithstanding all that you say that they have in place, they're still acting. They're still under the IMF.
Political mismanagement.
So if they kind of failing.
But political mismanagement. I mean, it's political mismanagement. I'm not going to dispute the fact that there has been political mismanagement.
Yeah.
And the last government was voted out of office for that reason in December. Okay, they spent 10 years in office. And, you know, I worked on Ghana when they had just entered an IMF agreement back in 2016. And I worked there for several years. After that, a new government came in, and we thought that this government would have improved the situation. But actually, there was a lot of political mismanagement and some bad luck. I mean, they had some borrowings where I think after COVID and so on, interest rate hikes affected them pretty badly.
Yeah.
And so their indebtedness went up. We have to watch that, because what we are doing in Trinidad and Tobago as a result of the deficit budgets that we've had is that we've resorted to borrowing to pay recurrent costs. You don't borrow to pay recurrent expenditures like wages and salaries. You borrow to invest in capital expenditure.
Depends on what you use the money for.
Yeah. So if you borrow and you're building roads and so on, you're building, you know, new infrastructure, hospitals, you're digitizing all across the country. Okay, fine. There's something to show for the investment because you have to service a loan. But when you borrow to pay civil servants their salaries, and to pay the salaries,
the reason why they didn't do the capital infrastructure work is because they had these debts, these employment costs, which they had to find some way to keep.
Yeah. Now,
instead of dealing with the public service properly.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, look, fixing the public service is probably the most important thing that any government can do.
I have had meetings with Colum Membert, you know, he's a graduate friend, he's a graduate
fellow engineer.
Yeah. And I presented him with my book.
Two engineers talking about economics.
And you know, while he agrees with what I say, he said he could never implement that. And I asked him why. He said there are forces behind us that are dictating, which I knew what he was talking about. The other thing is, I want to make the point, site value taxation. We have a problem with narco revenue in this country. In addition to the oil and gas revenue, a lot of money comes in through narco. And they use the proceeds to launder the money through real estate, the narco traffickers.
Precisely why I'm in favor of the property tax.
Hold on. So they have jacked the land prices up. I mean, prices of land is too high in Trinidad for what people make, the salaries that we have. Site value tax will deal with that. Will take that out. Will take out the heat in the economy.
But Nigel, explain to me how site value tax will do it and property tax will not.
Property tax is a disincentive.
How? Because
people don't want to pay that. They don't feel that. You see, the property tax wasn't administered properly. That's it.
Now we get to the point.
Right? I live in a 2-story building. Right? And my property tax is the same as a 1-story building just 100 yards from me. Same property tax.
So the implementation was poor and the valuations are inaccurate.
And my property tax is less than people paying property taxes in Chaguanas. The whole thing was crazy, badly administered. It needs to be scrapped and done again. But I don't think we should go back to property tax. We should go back to site value tax.
Yeah, on that property tax business, I can give you a real example of a crazy starting off position. Our property was valued at a certain level and taxed at a certain level. And when we complained that it was completely out of kilter with reality, Nigel, you know where we live, and you know the size and value of the property and so on. The tax was reduced by almost 100%. So I am happy, of course, for that. But I wonder where was the logic in setting the rate in the first instance.
Remember what I said earlier about the 3 things that we need to have is efficiency, transparency, and equity.
Yeah. Well, Henry George says that taxes on production are disincentive. He talks about the ease and inexpensiveness of collection of taxes. He talks about issue of certainty of amount. Those are the third canon, and the fourth canon is equity. Fourth canon is equity in the tax system. When I send my book to you, I will get it to you and you'll read it.
On the issue of ease of collection, again, that's part of the efficiency thing I was talking about.
Right.
It must
now
be
you are prescribing sales tax.
I said that it would be good to have a flat sales tax, 6%.
The cost of administering that.
6%, 6% sales tax, a flat sales tax that does not involve refunds like VAT, as opposed to 12.5% VAT.
It will be cheaper than the VAT, no doubt about that. But it may be more than the cost of it to administer it. It may be more than the cost to administer it. So it makes no economic sense. It may. I don't know.
I want to go into perhaps the final major point of the interview to ask you, gentlemen, to look at the reality of our situation today. We know about gas and oil revenues dwindling. We know of the loss of the dragon possibility. But we know we had a discussion earlier this week about the other possibilities, smaller in nature, but surely put together. In fact, one of the persons, I think it was Tony Paul, who made a projection that if we can make use of all of these small possibilities of oil and gas that are hanging outside there, we can make up some ground for the loss of the dragon. So that's one element of it. The element of a loss of revenue because the present government decides that it will do away with the revenue authority and what was projected. I think the figure was something like $10 billion in terms of what can be collected. And given the still, if you like, nascent state of the agriculture and the production of goods for export and so on, what is facing us into the future, and how do we come to grapple with those possibilities? Nigel, you want to start?
I think we are heading to the IMF. By the end of this year, we will be in the bosom of the IMF. I think so.
And all the implications for that?
Well, they will cut public servants, they will cut services, they will cut social services, they will. I mean, it would be a chain store. A chainsaw experience, you know, that if this government isn't careful, that is where we're heading. We're also going to have a devaluation if they're not and the devaluation is not bad, you know, once it is backed by the production of goods and services. The problem with Jamaica,
and that's a critical part. Yeah, what do we have to sell?
Yeah, the problem with Jamaica's failure and their runaway currency value is they didn't back that with goods and services. Make sure that they have goods and services producing so that you could export, so that, you know, we cannot have a devaluation and with the same status quo. We have to produce more.
So the question is, if you believe, whether you agree to it or not, we are heading to the IMF. What we get from the IMF is very little in terms of finances and so on. They clean up the economy and so on.
Even though we come to the
how do we benefit from that?
Even if we go to the IMF, I am contending that if you employ side value taxation, you could get out of the IMF in short order. I am saying so. I am saying that the whole thing will allow us to produce more, and the GDP will increase, inflation will come down, interest rates will come down, we will be able to pay our bills, we will be able to balance the economy.
And I can hear Derek asking you how.
A lot of assertions.
When Derek reads my book, he will understand. I'm not fearful of that.
It's a lot of, Nigel, I wish I could have had an opportunity to read it before we had this discussion because, when Tony...
But it isn't too expensive on Amazon. I think it's $17.
It's about $17. It's about $17. I was just pulling your leg.
You can afford that one.
It's about $17. But my point is this, I mean, a lot of what you've said about the site value tax sounds interesting. I just don't understand how it's going to be operationalized.
Well, Tony read my book. What do you think?
Well, but that was what, 3, 4, 5 years ago.
That was
I
10 years
remember
ago.
All right, I don't have that in my mind now. I did a review of it.
And I wrote 3 books after that. Three books I wrote after that. Yeah.
You're very prolific.
You're prolific.
Right?
Yeah.
You're
really
different from engineers. I remember.
Well, I am not getting work as an engineer, so I have to change my profession.
Very good.
Is that what happened to the former finance minister? He couldn't get work as an engineer. So
well, he failed as an engineer. You wouldn't go into that.
The man is supposed to
I might get sued.
build multi-story buildings all over.
I'm not commenting. I'm not commenting.
I don't want to get sued.
Let me ask Derek to answer the question that I posed. How do we go forward from here?
I think the government has a very serious task ahead of it, and this is a time for serious people as well.
Absolutely.
It seems to me that what we need is the formation or the setting up of what we might call an economic management team. I see the makings of it already, because from the newspapers, I see that the Minister of Planning and the Minister of Finance have been, sort of joined at the hip.
Brought together.
They've been joined at the hip, along with the Minister of Trade, Investment and Tourism, because I think those 3 are critical.
Yeah.
I think agriculture needs to be part of this team as well. I think the minister responsible for public administration also has to be part of this, because nothing can get done without a functioning bureaucracy. All of this hinges on the effectiveness of the bureaucracy. And I know Nigel said,
based on cutting-edge technology.
I just want to make a point about this, because Nigel said that the public service is overstaffed and it's bloated and we need to cut. I don't know. I've seen no evidence for that. I've seen no evidence. I'm not saying that it's not true. I'm just saying I've seen no evidence. What I can tell you is that the 2 largest sections of the public service are teachers and nurses. Which one you want to cut?
So is it a question of inefficiency and perhaps a lack of imagination in terms of structuring?
Absolutely.
I want to answer that.
Let Derek answer it first.
No, yes, there's a problem of productivity. There's a problem of efficiency. There's a problem of the application of technology, as Nigel was saying. We still have what they call clerk typists and so on in the public service at a time when everybody sits at their desk and does their own typing.
Absolutely, and they do nothing.
So I don't think if these people cannot be retrained and redeployed, then we don't need them. So yes, there is a need to rationalize the public service. There is a need for retraining, redeployment. I'm skeptical about the idea of cutting, because until you have a private sector that is capable of absorbing the labor that is discharged from the public service, then what are you going to do with all these people?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you're repeating what we had already back in 1990, a situation where you have high levels of unemployment and you don't have a private sector that is expanding, that is growing, that is capable of absorbing the labor that you want to put out.
On that score, Derek, what about entrepreneurship? Are we doing something? We have to give up on the old and former generation who were into the merchandising era, and that's fine. You have to have some stores that people buy stuff and so on. But the entrepreneurship that is required, how do we develop that?
Yeah. Years ago, I used to be on the board of the Small Business Development Company, which was set up in the NAR days to promote entrepreneurship and to support small enterprise development. I'm not sure how successful we were. I think there are people in Trinidad and Tobago that have entrepreneurial talent, but that group of people is on the down low. The dominant firms in the country, I'll give you one example. We talk a lot about the foreign exchange and who uses up the foreign exchange, but a lot of it is being used either for consumption purposes or to pay royalties overseas. Prestige Holdings declares the biggest profits, but what are they contributing to the society? Obesity, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. Okay, but yet their profits are among the highest. So, we need to look at our values. I think Nigel mentioned earlier educating people and so on. I don't know how we're going to deal with this problem. I mean, every KFC has a long queue.
You could train entrepreneurs, You could train them,
Yeah.
You could educate them,
We've tried that. We've done that for a long time. Yes, we've done that for a long time. Yes, we've had a lot of entrepreneurial training and development going on since the 70s. The question is, where are these people? And the people who are all the successful entrepreneurs that we have in the society didn't go through that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
none of them went through that.
One economist has
I have an
argued,
MBA, and I don't consider myself to be a top grade entrepreneur. I mean,
so
the training has to be more effective.
One economist has argued that if the government allows the traders to exist and to make millions, why should they bother themselves with doing the hard work of production for export?
Look, we also have to understand how the global market has functioned and impacted upon the Trinidadian business sector. Okay? I saw this morning in the press, Neil and Massey is acquiring a supermarket somewhere else. Neil and Massey already owns, Massey stores already own supermarkets in Barbados, in Jamaica, in Guyana. They control supermarkets across the Caribbean. Okay? Bermudas, which I consider to be the sort of classic case of this. The Bermudas people in Trinidad, in what you call that area there, Pitibug or what have you, are not producing goods for export. They've acquired a biscuit factory in Barbados. They've acquired a biscuit factory in Jamaica. They're in Costa Rica. In other words, what our entrepreneurs are doing is not expanding production in Trinidad and Tobago, but expanding their firms outside of Trinidad and Tobago.
But they're not invested in Trinidad and Tobago at all.
They're not, because they perceive there's a lot of instability, political and economic. They perceive that there's a lot of instability. Yes, economic instability in terms of the scarcity of foreign exchange, the volatility of the economy is very dependent on energy and so on and so forth. So what we have in the country is a case where we have entrepreneurs who are expanding their businesses by moving outside. Ansa Makal doing the same, moving outside. I just saw producing carob in India. Okay? So, it's not as if we don't have these things. It's just that they're not doing what we want them to do, which is...
I am saying to you that side value taxation will force them to invest in the country.
I think it will force them to leave the country.
No.
They're already invested elsewhere. It doesn't take them much to move, It doesn't take, in today's world, it doesn't take them much.
They're virtually gone because the capital is gone. The bodies are here.
Yeah, so what you could side value taxation and what you're going to achieve.
So, gentlemen, given...
Derek, when you read my book, you'll see what I'm talking about. That's all I have to
say. So, Nigel, you're going to...
repeating myself too much, ad nauseum.
Nigel, you're going to post off a soft copy to him?
Once, let him give you could pass his email address to me, and I will send it to him.
Yeah, you have to understand as well that I'm naturally a doubting Thomas.
No, that's fine. I meet this up all the time. I meet this up all the time. It is a one-man operation. I have no friends in this business.
So, gentlemen, let's conclude by giving us your best projections for the immediate, including, of course, the ability of the government in place to collect revenue from people who are earning revenue, earning salaries, earning profits, and so on. How do we begin to do that in a significant kind of way without the revenue authority? And I know where Nigel stands immediately on that. Go ahead, Nigel.
Well, I was going to say that I was looking at a video yesterday. I think I sent it to you, Tony.
Yeah.
60% of the people in America cannot afford their living expenses. 60%. In other words, the country is getting poorer and poorer, That's in America. Now, the same thing exists in Trinidad here. We know, people not seeing anything, but I know that the same thing probably exists here. So it means that the businessmen not making money, the businessmen need to get incentivized to do something about creating businesses in Trinidad. And that needs to be done quickly. We can't wait 5 years. We need to do it quicker than that. So they need to be incentivized. And I don't see any other way you could do it. If you could tell me a better way, a way that could be done, it could be done faster with all the benefits mentioned, I will look at it, I will accept it. But side value taxation to me seems to be the only way we will be able to get out of this hole that we have dug ourselves. And talking about the stranded gas, I wanted to make the point. The way to have the stranded gas worked on in Trinidad is to tell the oil and gas people, tell them we want a certain amount of money every year, above which you will you take as profit. In other words, if it means that if we anticipate that we could get $400 million in revenue, we will take that, and we're not using the tax system that is in place now. So we have a side value tax of $400 million, above which is yours. So, that's how I will deal with it.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying? Derek, you understand what I'm saying?
Well, again, it sounds very interesting as a concept. How one would go about implementing this is still unclear to me, and that has been the challenge I've had with in this discussion. A lot of what you've said is interesting, but I'm a brass tacks kind of guy. How do we do this? How do we do this? How does this work? And I'm at the end of the conversation, I'm no better off than when we started.
Well, promise me that you will read my book, and then we will talk further.
Well, I will give Tony my email address, and you can.
And I promise I'll host you all when both of you are fully hukora with the projections. So, gentlemen. Sorry, you wanted to say something, Derek?
Yeah, I was simply going to say that I think I mentioned earlier on that, I think there's very serious work ahead for the country. And this is not a time, when we can revert to our traditional behavior patterns. There's a severe adjustment that is required now. It means not just belt tightening, which is a term that nobody likes to hear, but it really means that we have to focus a lot more on improving productivity in both public and private sectors. We need to improve the capacity, the capability of the public sector, because as I said before, nothing will happen without it. And I don't think, I have to say, that successive governments have failed to address the dysfunctionality of the bureaucracy. And that is actually the biggest challenge that we face as a country.
Of course.
Yeah. And just talking about, I remember going back to Gordon Draper, being an appointed minister for whatever it was called, but
public administration.
Public administration. Yeah. And then we had, I think Selby Wilson was...
On the contrary, ever since Mr. Draper was minister back in 1992 to 95, it has been all downhill since then. All downhill since then. Either we had a square peg in a round hole, or we had somebody who was there but didn't last long enough to do anything.
Right. Wademark was one of those ministers.
He succeeded Gordon Draper.
Yeah. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for chatting with us this afternoon. And we surely would like to thank you because what we do on this program is really to reach out to the population, to people, to get away from the political old talk that is going on, to bring some solid information and perspectives to people on how they live their lives. One of the things that I talk about and write about constantly is the fact that people are outside of the boundary, are not playing on the same field that the rest of the national community is on. So thanks again. And in fact, the man who owns this radio station is one of those entrepreneurs attempting to do something. He was at a previous radio station, and that radio station went south, as it were, and he has taken on this challenge of developing this radio station. So Gentlemen, whenever you can, say a good word for the radio station. Sir Charles, you must know that Derek Browne told me that he heard the station where he is in America, wherever that is in America.
Beautiful.
So that we are reaching out far.
Yes.
Yes, Derek?
Indeed.
Right. So, Sir Charles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you.
And we just to say to our listeners, we don't have a program like this on Fridays, so come back Monday after the Parliament is being opened. That's going to be an interesting thing. Senators on both sides are to be named, including the independent senator with the third side, that is. So that should be interesting tomorrow. Thank you again. Shalom.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for being part of the Drive Time Exchange right here at New Era TT Radio. All right, so stick around. We'll be back.
In the Virgin Islands, you gotta pay taxes with a smile. In Puerto Rico, if you don't pay, straight in jail you go. Well, in Cuba and in Haiti, taxes higher than salary. Don't talk about New York and Caracas. You have to thief sometimes to pay tax. Even if your grandmother died, you can't get away from the tax. Don't care how you try and you try, you can't get away from the tax. Even if you kneel down and cry, you can't get away from the tax. You must doubt me, Sparrow wouldn't tell you a lie. You can't get away from the tax. Oh yes, Scavenger or Inspector, you can't get away from the tax.